So here we are in chapter 12. Adolescents, 12 to 20-year-olds, socio-emotional and spiritual development. And page 518 says, identity refers to a person's self-definition, which includes an understanding of your skills, your interests, characteristics that make you a unique person. So, how do you identify yourself? What's your identity? Let's see. I am 6'1" and weigh. Oh, I don't want to talk about that. I mean, I'm thinking, I feel okay, but every time I get on the internet and do that body mass index thing, it says I'm overweight. And I go clicking back on the pounds to see what it would take to get an acceptable reading from Mayo Clinic. I don't think so. So, my identity, I'm 6'1". In fact, I was at the doctor's office a while back, and the lady measured me and she said, "You're 6 feet and 1/2 inch." I'm going, no, you better check that again. I'm 6'1". And I realized that being 6'1" was an important part of my identity when she said that. And any idea what she told me? When you get older, the longer you live, you get shorter. I'm going, what? What? And then I realized being 6'1", for some reason, had become a part of my identity. And when I was younger, I didn't want to talk about how much I weighed because I didn't weigh enough. And now that I'm older and Mayo Clinic says I need to weigh less, I don't want to talk about it anymore. What kind of skills do I have? I just love mathematics. And I got you. And I enjoy teaching math. And I know I'm good at math. And I'm also good at working sumokus. And some students say I'm a good math teacher. But see, sometimes it's like, well, you know, we start talking about our skills and maybe we want to be careful that we're not being too proud about it. What interests do I have? Oh. Genealogical research and bass fishing. Oh wait, I have some other interests, and videotaping grandsons playing sports. Why did I say grandsons and not granddaughters? I don't have any granddaughters playing sports, so there's no one to videotape. It's just the grandsons. And what are some characteristics? What are some of my characteristics? Why do you think when I was an adolescent, people nicknamed me Motor Mouth? What do they mean by that?
Talked a lot.
I talked a lot, Logan. And you know what? I didn't like them calling me Motor Mouth, but I enjoyed being a talkative person. Then when I became a Christian and started reading in the Bible about the more you talk, the more you sin, and I'm thinking, whoa, I need to talk less. And what are some other characteristics? Well, if somebody says, "Can you help me?" that word help just jumps off the page. And I think, yes, what kind of help do you need? So I just like helping people with anything. And I guess that makes me a unique person. Now watch, I say, well, I don't know if I'd say unique. There's probably other people out there like that. Okay, maybe what makes me unique are my fingerprints. You understand? That sometimes we don't necessarily think in terms of uniqueness, We just think in terms of who we are. Okay, now I've shared a little bit about my identity. Let's hear you share something. I mean, I mentioned a whole bunch of things to give you some things to think about. So, in one of those categories of characteristics, interests, skills, give me something about your identity. And the people online, when I get home, I'll put up a little discussion page where you can put something on there to describe a dimension of your identity. Anybody want to talk about one of your characteristics, one of your interests, one of your skills that contributes to your identity? You're going to have to talk about one of them.
I'm a basketball player.
I'm a basketball player. Good for you. Logan? While you're thinking,
Identity?
What?
Personality?
I didn't hear you.
Personality or
A positive attitude? What did you say?
Personality.
Personality.
Personality. What about your personality?
I think I was a slow to warm up.
Oh, yeah. Slow to warm up.
Yeah.
Slow to warm up?
I'm
I'm a slow to warm up person. What about you, Lydia?
I'm a girl.
I'm a girl. And that's a characteristic? Okay. Any interest? Anything you have an interest in? Any hobbies? Anything you like to do?
I really like board games.
Board games.
Photography.
Photography.
try instrument.
Instruments? Musical instruments? Lydia?
Bike riding.
Bike riding. Now, do you see? It's just like you say, okay, all of these things are a part of our identity. Now, I've got a question here. How can you help the adolescents, other adolescents if you are one, but how can you help adolescents develop their identity? Oh, Anna, she was gone. What's one of your interests or hobbies? Let's see, we had board games and photography and musical instruments and bike riding.
I like games too.
What?
Games? Just
Games? Any kind of games?
Like group activity games.
Group activity games. Okay, because we're talking on page 518 about identity. And I'm wondering, what could you do if you were in the midst of a group of adolescents? What could you do to help them develop their identity? To become aware of who they are. Okay, could we talk about things you're interested in doing? Board games, photography, bicycling, musical instruments? And then, do you have any other interests? Then what about skills? Do you understand where sometimes I think it's important for us when we work with adolescents to just sit around and talk about these things and discuss these things and let them learn that this is who I am, and whether other people approve or not, that's beside the point. We're just saying this is my identity. My set of skills, my set of interests, my set of characteristics. I mentioned that when I was an adolescent, they called me motor mouth. Did any of you have labels that were given to you as an adolescent that identified one of your characteristics? One of your personality characteristics? If you're slow to warm up, then they probably said you were shy. People said that about me too. Tom's so shy. How could I be shy and a motor mouth?
Because you're slow to warm up.
Yeah, I'm shy with people I don't know. So around them I don't say anything at all, and then I save all my words for my friends and then just talk them to death. So do some of you have some characteristics that people have pointed out to you? Or are you just aware of them yourself? 2 of us are slow to warm up. What about the rest of you? Oh, if Anna said she likes group games, then you probably like to hang out with people and be very social and interactive. So if I suggested to you sometime that if you're having trouble getting your work done, put a sign on your door that says, "Do not disturb, I'm studying," you couldn't put a sign like that up if you wanted to. You would feel guilty by shutting the rest of the world out because you're just so socially oriented. Yeah, that's one of your characteristics. And Haley's going, yeah, that's one of her characteristics. In fact, would it be helpful sometimes to get a group of adolescents together? There's an exercise. It's called strength bombardment. It's a cool little thing to do. I've done it with adults and I've done it with young people and adolescents, and it's really, what you do is everybody gets pieces of paper, and on the pieces of paper you actually write positive things about other people in the room. Like Haley would say about Anna, she's a good friend to everybody. And we would say things about each other. And if somebody says, "I don't know what to say about so-and-so," then it's like, well, that just means they're maybe kind of a quiet, keep to themselves person, and they don't share a lot, so people don't know that much about them. Then say, well, ask some of their close friends, or tell me something about yourself. And sometimes it's healthy to even have conversations and say, which would you rather do? Read a book or ride a bicycle? Which would you rather do, Lydia?
Ride a bicycle.
Ride a bicycle. Logan?
Read a book.
Read a book. Haley?
Split.
Read a book or ride a bicycle?
Read a
I
book.
would say, I don't know, in the winter probably stay inside and read a book, but then in the summer when it's nice out, I like being outside.
I would take a book on my bicycle and ride to the park and then stop there and read it.
There you go.
Anna?
Ride a bicycle.
Ride a bicycle.
Ride a bicycle. Oh. I'm thinking, given a choice between reading a book and riding a bicycle, I'd go for the bicycle too. In other words, sometimes, one of the ways, when I ask the question, how can you help an adolescent develop their identity, just have adolescents get together and talk about some of these. Would you rather do this or would you rather do that? Page 520 says, adolescents who are members of an ethnic minority must also develop an ethnic or racial identity. I happen to believe that every person, it says adolescents who are members of an ethnic minority. I think every adolescent is a member of some ethnic group. Aren't you? It doesn't have to be a minority, and it's not just for minorities. I think it's important for every adolescent to examine their ethnic heritage. I just think they need to do that. We don't need to just limit that to minorities. Do any of you know your ethnicity, your ethnic heritage? Since I do ancestral research, I have a pretty good picture of my ancestors. You go back on an ancestry chart, you go back about 4 or 5 generations, and you'll see all these ancestors who came from foreign countries. And the original Bonines that came to America came from France as religious exiles. Who would be a religious exile from France? You know anything about the Huguenots?
Right now.
France was a Catholic country. A guy named Hugo listened to Martin Luther, got saved, took the gospel back to France. It spread so rapidly, the people who embraced the gospel were called Huguenots. It would be like in America. If a Baptist minister came to a country to evangelize, then people who got saved would be called what? Baptist? They were called Huguenots. And the Huguenot population kept growing and growing and growing. And because they embraced Christian values, they became a very strong force in France. And you would think, since they were honest, hardworking, productive people who cared for their neighbors, all those positive things that Christians do, that Catholic France would say, wow, this is great. But because France was Catholic, it looked to them like the Protestants might be taking over, and they just passed an edict that said, it's time for you folks to leave. So my ancestors left France and went to England as religious exiles. And because England couldn't accommodate everybody, they got on a boat and came to America and started a new life here. So I have some French ancestry. That's on my dad's side. On my mom's side, they came from England and Germany. Whoa, I thought England and Germany did a lot of fighting over the years. I mean, haven't they? They've not been the best of friends over the years. But what happened? English people came to America. German people came to America. My grandparents met from their English and German heritage and married each other. Actually, my grandfather is Bohemian. He came from Bohemia. But didn't Germany at one time claim all of that part of the world? And he was very verbal about his Bohemian ancestry. In fact, to the point to where I decided one time when I was doing this genealogical research to check out Bohemia and found out some amazing things about that country. And it was really interesting reading. So it's just like, okay, so I've got this English heritage, I've got this German heritage or Bohemian heritage, and I've got this French heritage. And then my sister, I'm talking about this at a reunion, she goes, well, what about our Native American heritage? I'm going, oh, Judy, I hate to tell you, but even though we're born in Oklahoma and our flag has a picture of the Native American peace pipe on it, it doesn't anymore. They changed it. I think they changed the symbols down there to something else now. But I said, we don't have any Native American blood. Yes, we do, she says. And I thought, well, if she really wants to be Native American, I guess let her be Native American. Don't argue with her about it. She could, I guess, check it out, couldn't she, by going to that DNA stuff and having a DNA test done. That it's just like, find out something about your heritage. I had an uncle who was a Mennonite. And that's all I knew about him, was he was a Mennonite. But he wasn't one of those Mennonites that, that only drove buggies. He was a different kind of Mennonite, whatever kind that is. And when he died and I went to his funeral, the funeral was in a Baptist church, because that's where he was going to church. I thought he was a Mennonite. Well, he was born into a Mennonite family, but he married a girl from a congregational family, and apparently they ended up going to a Baptist church. But this pastor was preaching, and he said, as I was getting ready to preach this guy's sermon, he said, I decided to do some research on Mennonites here in the Midwest in America and where they came from. And believe it or not, he told a story about people from Ukraine who came to America and brought with them hard red winter wheat And that turned out making Middle America the breadbasket of the world. And those were his ancestors who came around going, wow, how cool is that? So you might want to check out your ethnic heritage and just do a little checking on it to see where you came from and who your ancestors are. But there's another thing besides ethnicity that I think ought to be looked at, and that's where we ought to help adolescents examine their cultural heritage. Okay, what's my cultural heritage? Farming in Oklahoma, raising wheat and cattle. In fact, one time when I first came here to school and I was struggling in some of my classes, one of my roommates said, you know, Tom, maybe you just need to go back to Oklahoma and slop hogs. Now, he had no idea when he said that what a derogatory thing he said to me. Because I lived on a wheat farm where we raised cattle. We had neighbors who raised pigs. Can you tell by my tone of voice that we thought we were better than the people who raised pigs? Because we raised cattle, Hereford cattle, not just any kind of cattle. And the neighbors who had milk cows, we held them in the same esteem, but the neighbors who raised pigs and who raised sheep, we thought there was something wrong with them. And you say, why is it important to examine your cultural heritage? Because do you understand that with that kind of cultural heritage and the way I developed a prejudice back then, that if a guy says, yep, I'm from Iowa, my dad's a big pig farmer, I'm thinking, okay, that's cool. In other words, I have to, as an adult, I have to start recognizing that I had some prejudicial thinking in terms culturally when I was younger that I have to sweep aside and say, it's okay if you raise sheep, or if you raise pigs, or if you raise cattle. We're all in the agricultural industry, and we all make a contribution. But I had to make an adjustment in my cultural thinking. Do people in the country have a cultural prejudice against city adolescents? Did any of you who grew up on a farm in here? Haley, you did? Mm-hmm. Did you have any city cousins? Mm-hmm. Were they just a little bit light in the intelligence department?
Their other grandparents that lived closer to them actually lived on a farm, so they went out to that farm a lot. So they
developed some farm smarts.
Yeah.
So that made them okay.
Yeah.
Even if they're city kids. Okay, did you hear what I said? Are some of you city culture people offended by me talking about farm smarts? I mean, do some city people think farm and smarts don't go together? You just don't use those two words next to each other. It's like, why not? Well, because if you really were smart, you'd move from the farm and live in the city. I'm going, no, not necessarily. And if you live in a city, okay, who grew up in a city here? Who would call yourself a city adolescent? Okay, did your part of the city, did your cultural part of the city have any prejudicial thinking about other parts of the city? I mean, I live in greater Kansas City. And I've had people say, I said to somebody, I'm thinking about buying a house in the inner city and moving there for ministry. And what will some of the people in the suburbs say to you about that?
Why would you do that?
Why would you do that? Well, so I can minister to people in the inner city. And then they say next, but don't you know that's a dangerous place to live? It is. Yes. I'm thinking living in the suburbs can be a dangerous place to live. Did any of you live in a part of the city where everybody lived in high-rise apartments? Or did all of you have a single-story or two-story house? So do you know anybody who lives in a city setting where everybody lives in a high-rise apartment? So do you have any prejudicial thoughts about those people? I live in a house on 5 acres. And I see people, I go out to see my grandson, and I see people building houses, and they're building houses right next to each other. And I say to my wife, why do people do that? Why wouldn't everybody build a house on 5 acres? It just seems to me like having a house right next to another house, the houses are too close together. Spread them out a little bit. What are your thoughts about living on 5 acres? You like that, Haley? Anna? You like the idea? I have some friends my age who said, I moved away from my acreage and moved back to town so I wouldn't have to mow as much grass. There's a lot of upkeep taking care of a house out in the country. Oh, yeah, I guess so. But who wants to live in an apartment complex where you've got neighbors on both sides and right across the hall and you can hear everybody when they're talking about anything? That's just too close for comfort for me. And if we're not careful, sometimes our identity as to who we are culturally, ethnically, characteristically, interest-wise, skills-wise. I say to somebody, I like to go bass fishing, let's go bass fishing. They go, I don't think so. Bass fishing sounds boring to me. Now, as soon as they say that, because I like bass fishing, I can be a little offended and say, well, they must live a very boring life if they think bass fishing is boring. You understand that we just start to carry around this, I think it's the result of human depravity, that we carry around this basic tendency to think that people who don't like what I like, who aren't interested in what I'm interested in, are not as valuable as the rest of us. And somehow we have to help adolescents get beyond that and start to see value in all those other things as well. And I tell people one of the best things that happened to me was the wife I'm married to, because if that question, if she were here and I said, would you rather read a book or ride a bicycle? She'd go, read a book, because that's what she's probably at home doing right now. And riding a bicycle is not something she has any interest in. And she doesn't like bass fishing either. In fact, she said one time, the way I got her to go bass fishing with me is I bought a big bean bag and I put it in the boat, and she could bring a bag of books and sit on the bean bag and bounce around in the water and look at the scenery and listen to the birds and read a book at the same time. She just loved it. And one time she said to me, Tom, does that bother you that I don't fish? And I said, no, not at all, because then I get to focus on doing all the fishing myself, and you're here to watch me laugh when I catch one. And we're together and we have a good time. And one time when we got out of the water, this other fisherman said, I sure wish my wife would go fishing with me. And I said, well, on the way home, we're going to stop and do some shopping at Walmart and look for bargains. So it's kind of a trade-off. He goes, oh, what a way to run a good fishing trip. Because if everybody didn't fit right into his way of thinking, it was going to ruin life. So help all adolescents, not just minority students, develop their ethnic identity, their cultural identity, their social identity, and I think a lot of it has to do with just talking about it. Page 523 says between 5 and 10% of the adults in the U.S. identify themselves as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. 5 to 10% of America's population say, I'm gay, lesbian, or bisexual. If it's only 5 to 10%, how come there's so much commotion being made about that? I mean, it's like if you did a survey as to how many TV shows promote lesbian or homosexual behavior, I'm thinking if it's only 5 to 10% of the population, why are we making such a big deal about it? Why don't we just say live and let live? Page 525 talks about helping an adolescent figure out a set of personal values and morals to guide their behavior. What are you doing to figure out a set of personal values and morals to guide your behavior?
Studying the Bible.
Studying the Bible. It's one of the reasons you came to Calvary, was because the Bible was a big part of the program and you wanted to know what it had to say about stuff. Anything else you're doing? Do you talk about morals and behavior and values with your friends and your peers? Does that help you sort things out? Or do you just find yourself going, I think the rest of you. I have a whole bunch of retired friends, and they go, you're still working, Tom? I'm going, yeah. They go, when are you going to retire? And I said, I did retire about 12 years ago. I mean, doesn't retirement mean you start collecting Social Security? They go, no, retirement means that you stop working. I'm going, stop working? I have a friend who bought into that notion, and about 6 months after he quit working, I said to his wife in Sunday school one day, I said, so how are things going with the boss? Because he used to manage a whole big company, with the boss being home all day. And she said, well, he still thinks he has to boss people around because that's what he did all of his time at work. But I don't need him bossing me around in the kitchen. He needs to get a hobby. The man who led me to Christ, his wife told him to build a woodworking shop out behind the house so he could go out there and have something to work on so he wouldn't be getting underfoot, was her way of putting it, while she's in the house doing things without him there to make suggestions on how to do it better. You know what I've concluded? That God put us on this earth to work, and we probably ought to find some kind of work, some kind of productive activity that we engage in till we end up going to heaven. And if a guy wants to retire, so to speak, and quit working at whatever he does, that's fine. But have you found something else to do to make life productive? Or are you just sitting around molting or wilting or doing nothing of worth? And I think probably we ought to help adolescents figure out not only, in fact, I was thinking a couple of days ago, I talked about when I was growing up how we had the 10 Commandments on the wall in the classroom. What would you guys think if I got online and ordered a set of the 10 Commandments on some kind of a big poster and posted and got permission to put it on the wall in my classroom? So every time you came to class, I could point to the 10 Commandments just to remind us all of what God gave to his chosen people in the Old Testament as 10 guidelines for life. What would be your reaction to me having that on the wall in the classroom? You don't know?
Be fine.
Is that okay? Does it sound like a good idea?
Yeah.
We're in Bible college.
Yeah, we're a Bible college. Why couldn't we do that? I'm thinking, why couldn't we do it anywhere? If I ran a hardware, why couldn't I have the 10 Commandments up there just to keep people from being tempted to steal when they came in? If I ran a Walmart, why couldn't I put the 10 Commandments out there? I mean, so I'm thinking, based on your reaction, I'm going to get online and order me a poster with the 10 Commandments on it just to put on the wall, just as a reminder that these are some moral guidelines that God has given us that we probably need to think of on. If you went to the trouble to write them on tablets and to embed them in the culture of the nation of Israel, I'm thinking we probably ought to be reminded of them on a regular basis too. So did anyone, you're studying the Bible to develop your own personal values and moral guidelines for life. Can you think of anybody who's made comments to you that's contributed to your moral development as an adolescent? I was saved at 18. The man who led me to Christ. I wanted to do something for someone at church, and my parents didn't approve, and I told him about it, and I still remember he said this. He said, Tom, what you want to do for this person at church is a very noble thing. But if it doesn't meet with your parents' approval, then you must obey God, and He's telling you to honor and obey your parents. So you'll have to let somebody else meet that need that family has and honor and obey your parents so you can have a good testimony with their lives. What's your reaction to that piece of advice he gave me?
I think it's good.
And at the time I didn't like it, but because he led me to Christ and he was my pastor, I followed his advice. And so now watch what happens. He gave me some guidance as an adolescent that I didn't really care for. Now as an older person, after that summer when I came back to school and began to study more Bible and grow more in my walk with God, the more I came to the conclusion that was good. I mean, I didn't like what he said because it got in the way of me doing what I wanted to do, but I concluded that he was giving me good moral guidance, and it became a part of my own personal value system that you do honor your parents. And when my mom called and said, Tommy, your brother is having his 50th birthday and everybody's going to be there. Can't you come down? I said, when is it, Mom? And she said, it's on Friday night. I said, okay, I'll be there. She said, oh, thank you. I'd already had commitments for Saturday night. So after work on Friday, we get in the car, we drive 5 hours to Oklahoma to go to my brother's birthday party. We take him a present. And this is the brother who didn't want me talking about spiritual things when I came to his house. So what am I going to buy him? A chunk of coal for his birthday? No. I went out and found 50 different kinds of candy bars because he had a sweet tooth, and put them all in a box. No two were alike. And he opened the box up, and he could tell by looking that there were no duplicates. And he said, are there 50 in here? I said, I couldn't believe they make 50 different kinds of candy bars. And he just smiled, started eating them. And one of his little kids came over to get one, and he goes, hey, slapped his hand. He said, those are mine. It's my birthday. And I thought, well, neat. I did something for my brother who doesn't appreciate my Christian faith. And after the party was over, we said, well, we better get out of here. We got a long drive ahead of us. And my mom says, where are you going? I said, back to Kansas City because I have things I'm committed to do tomorrow. She goes, oh, I didn't know that. Well, why didn't I tell her that and tell her I wasn't coming to the party? Can you fill in the blank? Because that would have
Upset her.
disappointed my mother. And my mother, I mean, okay, maybe this is just part of what's going on in part of my value system today. I was not the best son when I lived at home, and I gave my mother a lot of grief. And I knew it, and I actually enjoyed doing it. And that was wrong. So now I am later in life saying, so what can I do to try to offset the bad things I did by just making my mother a happy camper and not disappointing her? So we got in the car and drove 5 hours back to Kansas City and went on with our lives. And our whole family talked about, I can't believe he drove down here. In fact, my brother even said, I can't believe you drove down here just for my birthday party. And I think it kind of softened him up to spiritual things. So basically, since, okay, now you're in this adolescent group possibly, but you're working with adolescents, but do you understand that the first time an adolescent hears a directive from God that would make his life better, he probably has a natural human depraved tendency to reject it. So guess what I do? I realize that the first time he hears it, he's not going to like it. But if I just let it go and let him process his feelings, then the next time he hears it, he won't be quite as offended about it because he's heard it before. And then the next time he hears it, he's now open to think about it. And the next time he hears it, it's kind of helping people develop morally and spiritually and in terms of their values is kind of like evangelism. And I don't know if you've heard this or not, but some of the books that are written on personal evangelism, one of the books I read that I thought was very valuable is, it says before most people will accept Christ, it takes about 7 touches in their life. In other words, about 7 different people over a period of time have to touch them spiritually before they're ready to trust Christ as Savior. And so then you say, so that means I'm just one person in this chain of people who will touch this person's life. And if I'm the first person to present the gospel to him, as I was one time on an elevator, I don't know why, but when I was a student here, I worked for a bank downtown, and a guy got on the elevator one day with me going up to the floor where we were working, and he was just taking God's name in vain right and left. And I might have heard this in chapel or something, but I just looked at him and I said, so, is God a friend of yours? He goes, what? I said, is God a friend of yours? You keep talking about him all the time, using his name. He goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, God is my heavenly Father because I've accepted his Son as my personal Savior. And I just wondered if you have a relationship with Christ. And he goes, you want a blankety-blank preach, you find a blankety-blank church, and what's more, keep your mouth shut in my blankety-blank elevator. And I go, gulp. Well, I'm not going to get to lead that guy to Christ today, am I? And then when I read that book, I thought, you know what? I might have been the first touch in his life. But isn't it encouraging to know that even if the guy cussed me out and got mad at me, I'm the first person to touch his life. Somebody else comes along, somebody else comes along, somebody else comes along, and eventually he gets saved. And then what happens when he gets to heaven? You know that song we're all going to sing when we get to heaven? Thank you for giving to the Lord. I'm a life that was changed. And I don't know if we'll get to go around and thank all the people in person who made an impact on us, who touched our lives, and who did something to contribute to our moral and spiritual and values development, to give us some guidance along the way. But I will tell you this, when you're working with young adolescents and middle adolescents and even older adolescents, you'll encounter a lot of resistance to the values that you've extracted from the Bible and to the moral guidelines that the church gives to people, and you just have to need to be patient and prayerful to help people. Is it okay to say this, or will this be offensive to you? To help people grow up to where they reach the place where they start to live this book talked about, the transition from childhood to adulthood, where they become adult Christians who embrace adult values and adult morals and behave in an adult fashion. Page 527 talks about how do cultural differences influence moral development. How did your culture influence your moral development? Okay, now I've already told you, I grew up on a farm. Haley, you did too. Did you have to do work on the farm?
Some.
We had a neighbor who was a dairyman, and that's hard work. And he had mostly daughters. He had all of his daughters out there working in the barn, milking cows, and my dad used to say, that's awful for him to make those girls work like that. Now, see, he could say that because he had 3 older sons and 2 younger daughters who didn't have to do anything. See, there's my prejudice coming through, isn't it? But did you have to work on the farm?
Not a lot. My 3 older sisters were more.
They did all the work?
Yeah.
Oh, boy. So, your culture didn't teach you what's called the Protestant work ethic? What's the Protestant work ethic? Why is it called Protestant? Why is it called a work ethic? Why did God put us on this earth? What did he tell Adam to do in the Garden of Eden? His job was to do what? To dress it and keep it? Did God create us to do work? So, basically, the Bible teaches a work ethic. Do any of you know verses that talk about if you don't work, you don't eat? You know any other verses about work? Do your work as what? Unto the Lord. And if you're the supervisor, recognize that you have a supervisor in heaven that oversees you. So, my culture taught me the Protestant work ethic, even though we didn't go to church. My dad just taught us that working hard is just a part of life. And how did he do that? He just made us work hard. He'd plant a huge garden and then make us go out there and chop the weeds out of the garden. He'd plant enough potatoes. I don't know why he did this, but he would plant potatoes where we'd have to throw them away. But he just had us plant that many potatoes to the point where I still remember the pain I felt in my back walking along putting potatoes in that little row that he had cut with a plow, and then he'd come back and fill that one in and make another one and say, fill that one up, boys. And we'd give potatoes to neighbors and relatives and friends. And so he taught us the Protestant work ethic, and then did you catch, we would raise this stuff and give it away. And he taught us to be charitable. Now, is that part of my moral development? Learning to work hard and being charitable? I'm thinking, yes, it is. But he wasn't doing it from a Christian perspective. He was just doing it from the perspective of, because that's why we're on this earth, to work hard. And when you work hard, you share some of your bounty with other people. You help other people. In fact, I'm thinking my mindset of helping others was part of my cultural influence in terms of my moral development. Because he was always helping other people. And I inherited some of that or learned that from him. So now can you think of some cultural influences that contributed to your moral development? Anything that happened in your upbringing that's helped make you the moral person you are today? Were any of you taught to tithe by your parents? Okay. Were you taught anything else?
Always to say like please and thank you.
May I please and thank you? Were you taught anything else? My dad came in from the field one day, and some windows were broken out in the chicken house. To keep it warm in the winter, we had glass windows in it to let the sun come in. And he came in the house and he said, "Who broke those windows?" And then here's what he said, "Were you boys out there throwing rocks?" I have a choice to make. What are the two possible answers? Tommy, were you out there throwing rocks at the chicken house and broke a window? I can either say yes or I can say no. What would you suggest I do if I was really out there throwing rocks and I broke a window? Say what?
Yes.
Yes. I threw a rock and broke a window. Or were you taught to lie? You go, what? The phone rings and you answer it and you go, "Dad, it's Mr. So-and-so. He wants to talk to you." And your father says, "Tell him I'm not here." Did that happen to anybody? I'll tell you what, in all the adolescents I've worked with in life, I've met a number of them who've told me that they were told to tell somebody a lie because the father didn't want to talk to him. What could that father have said?
I'm unavailable.
Tell him I'm unavailable. I mean, there's a truthful way to handle this stuff. So what? I mean, I think our culture, the world we live in, even teaches us. If someone says, "How do you like my new hairdo? How do you like my new haircut?" When I was in college, I don't know why the girls did this, but to get ready for banquets where they got all dressed up, they would go to a beauty shop. Have any of you seen pictures of them where they would take their hair and stack it up on top of their head? And they were called beehives. Why were they called beehives?
Because it looks like a beehive.
Because it looked like a beehive. Okay, now what's your assessment of a beehive? Is that the dumbest looking thing you've ever seen? Or does it look attractive? Okay, when I was in college and the girl I was dating did one of those, I thought the same thing you think. That is the dumbest looking thing I have ever seen. And when I go to pick her up to take her to the banquet, what does she ask me?
How do I look?
Do you like my hair? And here's what some people would say. Better to tell a lie than tell the truth and damage the relationship. And I say, I'm sorry, but that is not counsel from the throne of God. That does not come from the Word of God. And here's what I said to her. Fortunately, the way they get their hair like that is they put stuff on it and then they sit under a machine that blows hot air on them. So the hot air makes their face turn kind of pinkish. And I said, Nina, when you get your hair fixed like this, you just have a glow about you that makes you look so pretty. Oh, she says, thank you very much. And what I was doing was talking about the hair dryer and how it gave her a countenance that looked good in spite of her hair. I just didn't have to give her all the details. I think there's kind, considerate ways to be truthful. You don't have to be painfully truthful. You just tell people the truth, but try to, you do it in love for sure, but you try to do it without being offensive. And I think, again, that's part of our moral and cultural development. I talked last time about going to visit Caterpillar Tractor, where people who work there would steal stuff. They bring stuff home from work, they put it in their shop, and the child sees it, and what does that child conclude? That it's okay to steal. And if I'm at the store and I want something, I'll steal it. But see, this is what's strange to me. The same adolescent that I'm trying to help him deal with his stealing, and he says, well, my dad steals stuff all the time. I said, well, let's talk to your dad about that. And so we call his dad in and we talk to his dad about it. And here's what his dad says. Hey, taking stuff at work, I work hard all day. That's one of the perks of working. You don't work at the store, so you don't take things from the store. That's different. And you understand, this adolescent hadn't made that connection. He didn't see that difference. And so we had to talk to him about what he's going to do to get his life back on track so he doesn't have this great temptation to steal things. And he started doing it because of what he saw his father doing. And his father goes, that's different. Now, based on what that father just told me and this adolescent child in this meeting we had, guess what happens? So if the boy gets a job at the grocery store, then what's he entitled to do? Steal stuff because he works there. It's one of the perks. And I'm thinking there's just a lot of adults in this world today who haven't embraced a strong biblical value system and haven't thought about the moral guidelines that should dictate their behavior. And hopefully, and part of my frustration in talking about this is that in all the years I've worked with adolescents, I find a lot of times the adolescents have just picked this stuff up from the homes they're growing up in. And the homes never intended for them to learn that. They just didn't think about what they were teaching. Page 529 talks about another major developmental task that adolescents face, and that's developing emotional and behavioral autonomy. The ability to be independent in their thinking and action. Have you ever heard an adolescent, when they were asked, why did you do that? And they said, because everybody else was doing it. And it's like, no. We have to somewhere make a decision. We have to develop the ability to think for ourselves and make individual, independent decisions and take action no matter what everybody else around us is doing. And it happens that the more Christians live in an unchristian world, the more we're driven to do that. The more you have to help adolescents develop this ability to not follow the crowd. To ask yourself, what does God want me to do? How does God want me to live? What does God want me to say? And if everybody else is doing the wrong thing, I mean, you say, I go to the lunchroom at work and I sit down and they start talking about stuff and I tell them that's wrong and they all get worked up and bent out of shape. Don't preach at me. Don't be such a prude. And I'm thinking, I'm just going to have to do the right thing even if nobody really understands. And the textbook, a secular textbook, calls it a major developmental task. Because if you don't develop that during your adolescence and early adult years, if you don't develop the ability to make an independent decision, then you're just going to follow the crowd wherever they go. I decided some years ago that when I'm watching television, if the show that I'm watching, whether it's an adventure show or an entertainment show or a sports show, if somebody takes God's name in vain, one of the 10 Commandments, I immediately hit the button and change the channel to go someplace else. That's my way of registering with my Heavenly Father that I'm sure that offends Him, so it offends me enough to where I'll change the channel and go look at something else. So, do you have any idea what that means? If you have a remote control television? What do you think? The button for changing channels gets worn out and I have to go buy a new remote every once in a while because I can't watch a lot of shows all the way through because these people are offending my Heavenly Father. And I think there again, it's like you have to make an independent decision. The Super Bowl's coming around, and some churches have a Super Bowl party, and I think if they want to have a Super Bowl party, go ahead. But do I have to go to the Super Bowl party just because the church is having one? No. Let the people who want to have it go to the Super Bowl party, and those of us who don't, we'll do something else. Make an independent decision. Do some independent thinking. Have you found yourself in a situation as an adolescent that you've had to make some choices to move away from a table in the cafeteria? Or to say to your friends, sorry, I just don't feel comfortable doing that? Or have you felt the pressure to say, well, I don't really agree with him, but I don't want to be a social outcast, so I'll go along with the crowd? And I'm saying, work on that major developmental task. And probably most of us have to work on that for our entire lives. When you become a parent, you have to make a decision. If this is the way God wants me to raise my kids, then this is what I'll do. And if all of my Christian friends criticize me for it, I'll just have to, as I say to some of my friends, both Christian and non-Christian, in the spirit of Thoreau, you know Henry David Thoreau, let each man march to his own drum beat. And my drum beat happens to be, what does God say about it? And how does God want us to live? I don't know who got me started doing this, but it was a wonderful exercise. If you have a question about something, put it on a piece of paper and read all the way through the Bible and write down all the things that God says about it, and then you will have collected the whole counsel of God on that issue, at least as best you can with where you are in your life spiritually. Page 530 says, recent research indicates that stormy and stressful encounters between parents and teens are not the norm for adolescents. Were any of you told by somebody in the world that stressful and adversarial relationships are just part of being an adolescent with your parents? Now, for some kids, it is more stressful and confrontational than it is for others. Probably the difficult child will probably be more difficult as an adolescent than the compliant child would be. But what the book says is 75% of teens report positive relationships with parents. That's 3/4 of them. Well, how come then when you hear teenagers talking about relationships to parents, all you hear is negative stuff? Wait a minute. Is everybody saying the negative stuff? Or just are a few negative people talking all the time, and the people who have good relationships don't say anything? So it sounds like, it's that thing they talked about in the previous chapter, it sounds like everybody's having a stormy relationship when in fact they're not. But if you were an adolescent who had a good relationship with your parents through your adolescent years, and you're sitting at a table with some adolescents complaining about their parents and how how strict they are, and da 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 da, and just on and on and on. Are you going to speak up and say, wait a minute, maybe you ought to be a little more submissive and it wouldn't be so tough on you? Are you going to be brave enough, courageous enough to hold your hand up at that table and say that? Or will you just get up and take your tray and move someplace else and get away from there? I mean, are you just naturally confrontational where you're going to take those people on? I'm not. I'm just going to get up and leave. I have a friend, a Christian friend, who says, Tom, I don't understand why you just don't speak up and say something. And this guy would say, I mean, I've talked to him long enough to know this, he would say that he's taken that spiritual gifts inventory and he has the gift of prophecy. And what that means is he'll just butt into a conversation and tell people that's not right. Oh, and I have to say to him, I say, well, apparently my spiritual gift is peacemaking. So I'm just going to move away from the table so this doesn't become confrontational. Now, if you're a peacemaker and I'm a peacemaker and we're going down the road and I'm driving and I start to drive off the road, are you going to just be a peacemaker and sit there and let us self-destruct? Or are you going to become a little confrontation and say, hey, watch out? And my wife and I are both of that temperament. And when I'm driving down the road and she goes, aren't you getting too close to that car? Okay, in my heart of hearts, I've been driving a long time. I don't think I'm too close to that car. But out of respect for the wife that God has given me, what do you think I do? I hit the brakes and make the distance a little bigger. Why? Because I'm not going to argue with her about it. Why make a confrontation? Just be as, what does the Bible say? As much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. I'm just going to say, I'm going to try to be a peacemaker here. But I have some Christian friends who would criticize me for not speaking up and saying something. Now, I will say this. If the guy at that table came to me and said, you heard me going off about my parents and you picked up your tray and left, and they said, so what? Do you think I'm wrong going off on my parents like that? Now, if they come and ask me, what am I going to tell them? Yes, I do. I even had an adolescent say to me one time, he said, how come Haley's parents let her do almost anything she wants to do, and my parents are so strict? And I said, you know what, Joe, if you lived at Haley's house, her parents wouldn't let you do anything you want to do. Haley has figured some things out that you're still trying to learn. And he goes, like what? And if you were in a room, Haley, you would say what? Like learning to honor and obey your parents? I mean, haven't you figured that out? That if you do what your mom and dad tell you to do, life goes better? You say, well, what if you do it and argue? Life doesn't go as good as if you just do it because they told you to. Say, well, I'm just an argumentative personality. Well, maybe that's a part of your personality that needs to be a little bit altered so that you're not so argumentative or critical. Okay, so 75, in other words, when you start working with adolescents, 3/4 of them probably had good relationships with their parents during their adolescent years. They just don't talk about it. And the 25% who have problems, they talk about it all the time. Page 537 talks about cliques and crowds. Did you belong to any clique or crowd when you were an adolescent? Who played sports? So you guys played sports. So four of you. So you kind of hung out with the athletes?
Not really.
No.
Oh, you didn't.
No.
You didn't. You just enjoyed the sport. You didn't necessarily like the attitudes that some of those athletes had?
I went to a pretty small school, so like everyone kind of got along with everyone.
Okay, so you went to a little school where we all kind of got along. We didn't have cliques and crowds. How cool is that? if you belong to any cliques or crowds during adolescence, what would it have been? Let's see. Who did I not hang out with as an adolescent? Were there any crowds? Okay, apart from school, were there any adolescent cliques or crowds or groups in your community or neighborhood or church or wherever that you did not hang out with? Do any of you remember a TV show with some guy named Fonzie who rolled cigarettes up in his shirt sleeve?
I've heard of it, but I never watched it.
And he was just offensive to everybody? Well, guess what? When I was an adolescent, those kind of people, most of us didn't associate with. Because they were just going to get in trouble. And you knew it. And they were kind of looking for trouble, so why hang around with them? Stay away from them. There was another crowd that, and see, this was before I was a Christian. There was another crowd that my dad encouraged me to stay away from. And those were the people who were partying all the time. Somehow, underage people getting alcohol and drinking, he said there's nothing but bad comes out of that. Just stay away from it. When it talks about a crowd, people with similar attributes, are there certain people at church you kind of gravitate toward? And others you kind of stay away from? Or are you like Haley and Lydia said, that we were friends with everybody? How cool is that? Peer pressure and aggression is talked about on page 538. So, have you ever been aggressive just for fun to see what it was like? When they put me on a bus, growing up in a little country school where it was just everybody knew everybody, we're all farmers. When they put me on a bus and bused me to the city in 9th grade, and I came home and told my dad, there was a guy on the playground who just seemed to want to push me around. And here's what my dad said. He said, son, he said, if you let him push you around, he'll just keep pushing. You just need to stop him in his tracks and nail him. And I thought, ooh, I just didn't have the stomach to just, nail somebody. So the next week at school, when he started messing with me, I grabbed him by the shirt and I threw him on the ground and I stepped over him and I said, my dad says I ought to just nail you. But I'm thinking, I don't want to do that. That would hurt. You leave me alone, I'll leave you alone, and let's try to get along. And that was the end of it. But you know what? I was following my father's advice. I just didn't have the fortitude to go ahead and bust him right in the chops. But just taking him down made me feel sick to my stomach. It's like there's something inhuman. There's something uncivilized about treating other human beings that way. And I have to tell you, I don't know where all of this aggression and violence is coming from. But I know this. I have a natural disposition to dislike violence, but if I watch violent movies long enough, I start thinking about doing some of the things they do in those violent movies to people who irritate me. I'm thinking violent movies and violent TV shows and violent video programs and violent games are just very harmful to the human race. I mean, if they talk about that we should limit how old you can be to consume tobacco, and some people now are talking about making it completely illegal in the state for anyone to smoke tobacco because it's so harmful to your health, it seems to me like somebody ought to be making some rules for the people in Hollywood who make movies, that there's certain stuff you shouldn't put in movies because it's too damaging to the human race. Did you know that the TV industry and the movie industry used to have a code of conduct that they subscribed to a certain code that said we won't promote certain kinds of things in our movies? That code has been thrown out the window. And now what's happened is we've just got a mess on our hands that probably somebody needs to do something about. So how did your school impact your adolescent development? Your high school and your junior high. Do you remember how that impacted your development? Was that a time when you made a lot of friends, or you became a loner? Or you made a few friends? You probably made some friends, didn't you? Here's what I'm thinking. If adolescents are going to develop friendships, I think God created us to be social creatures, and if we're going to help them develop friendships, we probably ought to do it in a positive setting. That's why when our daughters were adolescents, we told the youth pastor, anytime you want to come to somebody's house for a party, our house is available. And they would bring the kids over there all the time, just so they could hang out in a home and eat some pizza and play some games and have fun together, just to develop socially. Because in my mind, if we weren't doing something to promote healthy social interaction, then they're going to go someplace else where they're going to promote unhealthy social interaction. How did your neighborhood impact your adolescent development? Did the people in your neighborhood influence the way you lived as an adolescent? Or was your total influence pretty much your family and your school and your church? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, is that where most of your moral and values training came from? And spiritual training. I mean, granted, my parents taught me a lot of moral values, but they didn't take me to church, and that didn't happen until I got out on my own. And I wish my parents would have done something sooner, but they didn't. And God has been good enough to make up for some of it. But I can either resent what they didn't do or appreciate what they did. And I would prefer to appreciate what they did. Okay, see you on Monday. And on Monday we'll start, bring Dobson's book with you for Monday.